Hi everyone, Taya here from Quilting Delights, and thanks for joining us again today. If you have friends who are quilters and they've not subscribed to our channel yet, please give them our information, youtube.com/Quilting Delights. Have them subscribe and they too can get some helpful hints and tips on all of the different projects that we're working on. Today I'm going to talk to you about how to finish your quilt top with traditional binding. We have another video up that talks about how to face the front of a quilt and how to do peeper binding fast and easy. So check that video out as well. Those two techniques are on another video. But today I'm just quickly going to go through how traditional binding works and a couple of helpful hints and tips about traditional binding. You can also go to our website, quiltingdelights.com, and go to free downloads, and there is a handout, a 3-page handout that covers traditional binding, facing a quilt, and peeper binding. So download those and you'll have all of the information in writing, in color, with pictures ready to go for you. Okay, so let's talk about traditional binding today. One of the questions that always comes up is, how do you bind a quilt? How do you even know where to start? Well, once you've got a quilt squared up, the next question is, do I do regular binding, straight of grain binding, or do I do bias binding? And a couple of rules of thumb to think about. If you're doing a square quilt, I would do straight of grain binding because then it doesn't wave or bend on the edges. Bias binding has a stretch to it, so if you aren't careful with it, you can really get a look that you don't want. Now, with that said, the only exception to doing bias binding on a regular square quilt is if you have a stripe that you really love and you want it to roll across the edge, you have to cut that on the bias in order to get the stripe to roll. And we do have a video up on how to cut bias binding, so you can double check there and see what to do and how to cut that bias binding. And I'm pretty sure we used a stripe in there because we wanted you to see how cool that effect was. All right, for today's video and helpful hint, we're going to assume straight of grain binding, and what I want to show you is how to attach it at the corners and how to attach it around when we join them together. One of the things that is most important, and every single time I skip this step, I pay the price for it. You want to lay your quilt out and you want to make sure when you put your binding all the way around that you don't have a seam. Like this one is awfully close to the edge. You cannot have a seam in your corner. It doesn't fold over, it adds way too much bulk. So before you get too far into the process, once you make your binding, you're going to double check and make sure that it goes all the way around without a seam in the corner. Now I like to use my green clips, and so what I'll do, I start about halfway down and I make sure that I leave at least 5 inches before getting started, and I will fold my corner the way it's supposed to go, and then I will clip it. And it doesn't mean that that's exactly where it's going to sew, but what it does is it gives me the spacing to determine whether I'm going to have any seams in the corners. I was doing a table runner the other day, and I thought, oh, you know, I can judge this. I can see what's going on. And lo and behold, out of 4 corners, I had 2 that had seams in them. So it was one of those, darn it, and take it all off. I had to take it all off. On the one corner, I just took it back to where it was. Now see, I'm way too close here for my comfort having that seam in the corner. So what that tells me is I'm going to start a little bit further down. I'm going to start down here, and then I can make sure that I don't have a seam in the corner. I don't care whether it's before the corner or after the corner. I just don't want it in the corner. Okay, so let me just double check this, make sure that we're all good here. And now I'm past it, so it's not going to be there. So this is where we're going to start. You can start on a bigger quilt, you can start further up, but I just wanted to give you a heads up on that. Okay, first thing we're going to talk about is what size binding to use. On a quilt, I use 2.5 inch binding. If I'm doing a table runner, sometimes I'll do 2.25 inch. If I'm doing an apron, where it's just 1 layer of fabric or 2 layers of fabric with no batting, I'll do 2 inches. So the handout that we have as a free download on our website gives you 2 inches, 2.5, and 3 inches. On flannel, sometimes I'll do 3 inches because I really like that heavier edge around. And then it gives you how many strips and how much fabric you need to purchase for a binding. It also gives you the formula to figure out how many inches of binding you need. So I'm going to do a 2.5 inch strip today, and we need to have enough fabric of the strip. We need to have enough of the strip so that we can turn the corner, but also have 4 or 5 inches left to put it together with. So I want to talk about real quick how to sew these seams together. And you know that when you have, when you're doing your bias seam, what that means is you're overlapping your strips. And a very dear friend of mine who taught here for many years always told me the way to remember it is you're going to sew from Oregon to Florida. You sew from Oregon to Florida. So you're going to go from the upper left-hand side to the lower right-hand side. If you sew from New York to California, you're going to end up ripping it out and doing it again. So Oregon to Florida, corner to corner, and when you do it, you want to overlap your fabric. So in other words, we're going to sew our seams. Don't cut your selvages off until you need to, but we're going to overlap the fabrics like this. We're going to overlap the fabrics like this, and we're going to sew from Oregon to Florida. And if you leave your fabrics overlapped like this, it gives you a valley to start with. So see here we have, because it's overlapped and we have a little extra fabric, it gives you a valley to start with, and it gives you a target at the other end to aim for. So you can draw your straight line, but it's also helpful to have that. So this would be a selvage edge, selvage edge. Then what we're going to do is we're going to cut the extra off, but when you cut the extra off, I want you to cut it a 1/2 inch away from the seam. And the reason we do this is because we're going to press this open. And sometimes a 1/4 inch seam pressed open in a binding, it's kind of like when you get your hair cut too short, it really wants to stand up. And with a 1/2 inch seam, it'll really lay flat. You can see how flat it lays. And that'll spread the bulk of that seam. You definitely don't want to do pressing to one side because that just really bulks it up. And so now when we fold this over and we press our seam the length, you can see that it's nice and flat and it's not going to cause a lot of problems along the edge. I like to refer to it as the bowling ball in the snake. If you don't have a really flat seam like this, it'll bump over, and we don't want that. Okay, so again, we're going to make sure that we don't have any part of this. So you can see that's almost 1.5 inches, 2 inches. We don't want any part of this in the corner. So you've got to have it that far off the corner or that far before the corner when you're sewing. So we'll double check that. Okay, so we've already checked it. We know we're going to start down here. So I like to sew the binding on with a 3/8 inch seam. I'm going to set my machine up. I have a Bernina on mine. That means I'm going to go 3 to the right. You can use a 1/4 inch foot, but I just prefer using my clear foot. You can see I've used it a lot. I actually had to super glue it. This is a 34D foot, and these soles are replaceable. So if you have a 34D foot and you've broken it like I did mine, then check with your dealer and they'll be able to help you. Okay, I'm going to start down here because I need this 5 inches or so. This is a small block. I don't have a lot of room here to work, but it's a good way to show you that you can do it on anything. So I'm going to start sewing, and I don't back tack on this part. Oops, I forgot to set my... I was basting something here a little bit ago and forgot to put it back to the... There we go. So now I'm at 2.5. I am going to back tack just because I had a basting stitch. And I'm going to go just to the 1/4 inch, and then I'm going to back tack. Cut my threads, and I'm going to take it out. I'm just trimming off this little bit of extra quilt that's here, and you'll see why. You really want the edges of your quilts very, very even. And I'm looking at this, and I think on this machine, this is a 1/4 inch. So I'm actually going to move my needle back over one. And this is really important. When you first start quilting, this is when you want to set your seam allowance, and that is just a little too narrow for me. There we go. Much better. And what's nice about this is I can show you the difference. So the top one is a 1/4 inch, and if I folded it around, I would have way too much on the back side. So now, because I have 3/8 of an inch, it will fold over beautifully and be just past, it'll be just past where the fold is on the front. So you could, if you wanted to, sew it down by machine and do that on the front side. I'll talk about that a little bit here at the end. But I prefer to sew my quilts, I prefer with traditional binding like this, I prefer to sew them down by hand. I actually like doing that in the evenings. Gives me some time with my husband. Okay, so we've sewn to a 1/4 inch. You're better to be 1 stitch short than 1 stitch over. And we actually, on the second one, we only went to 3/8 of an inch. So whatever your seam allowance is, you're going to stop that same seam allowance back. Now I've got my 3/8 inch seam, and I'm going to stop 3/8 of an inch from the end. If I were doing a 1/4 inch seam, I would stop a 1/4 inch from the end. Now I can turn my fabric for the first fold, and you want to see that this is angled exactly into the corner. Absolutely perfectly angled into the corner. And as I'm doing that, you'll notice that it's parallel with the quilt. So that's what we're looking for, is this straight edge, tight and straight. Then we're going to fold it back down. And I want to talk about how important this is. So if you look at this, and I'll lift it up so you can see, everybody thinks, I think, that what your goal is to make it tight and parallel with the top of the quilt or the seam that we just sewed, and that's not true. What you need to do is, it's like a 32nd of an inch. You just barely want to be able to see the fabric on the back side. And what that does is it creates the room that you need to turn this and be able to do mitered corners. So we're going to have it just a little tiny bit over. Now here's the trick of the day. Here's the tip and trick. I used to start at the 1/4 inch and go down and back. Well, that caused a number of problems. First of all, it would stuff it into the hole. And second of all, my corners blew out. So what I want to share with you is, if you'll start a 1/2 inch to an inch down, back tack off the edge first, making sure that you have that the edge of your quilt is exactly even with the foot. Go completely off and then start sewing back down. It avoids pushing it into the hole, and it seals that corner. So I'm just going to finish sewing this all the way around like we've done, and then I will show you how to put these two ends together. And I've left enough distance between here to go ahead and put these together. Now, one of the things I noticed when I was sewing was that my corner was catching a little bit, and that's because I just realized, like I told you at the beginning of the video, that my 34D foot, the plastic is cracked, and I'll be replacing that before the day is over. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at this. And one of the things that's really fun about binding, in my opinion, is this little trick. And what I do is I just cut the end off, because I know I've got plenty of overlap. I cut the end off, and what I'm going to do is take that little cut off, and whatever the width of your binding, so I did 2.5 inches, that's what the overlap is going to be. So my overlap, I don't know if you can see here, but this is where my bottom piece is. And I'm going to lay that little end piece that I cut off right there. And now I'll stretch it just like 2 little threads. And now that's where my cut is going to be, to trim to the right length. So I'm trimming it to the right length. And you can see that it is exactly, the overlap is exactly the width of this piece. To put these two together, it's really, really important that first you have some pins ready to go. And second, that the project is in your lap. It's the easiest way to get this overlap correct. If you have it the other way, where the project is on the table, where your quilt is on the table, it's harder to get this turn correctly. So what I do is I open both sides, so I've got the project in my lap. I open both sides, and I have the left one open and the right one open, and I just take the right one and I patty cake it over the left one, and now I'm going to match my corners. So I put a pin on this side. I put a pin on this side. And then, once again, and I'm going to squish my project together so that it gives me some leeway to sew here. And then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to sew from Oregon to Florida, but I'm going to recenter my needle. So I'm going to recenter my needle because I need to sew a straight line. And on my machine, I happen to know that I have a center line right here that gets me where I want to go. So I just track that center line on my table, and it gives me a really great seam. All right, I'm going to trim that. You don't have to back tack. You can if you want to, but I typically don't. And then before you cut this, it's really important, before you cut this, you double check and make sure that it's the right length and that you haven't twisted it. So it looks like it's perfect, and so I'm going to go ahead and trim that, and I'm going to trim it to a 1/2 inch from the seam. I'm going to trim a 1/2 inch from the seam. I'm going to finger press those seams out. Fold it in half, and then reset my needle back 2 to the right in this particular situation. 2 to the right, and then I'm going to start back here, and it is a perfect fit. Now sometimes I will tell you honestly that sometimes I actually pin this because I don't want it to shift, and unless I'm using my walking foot or my dual feed, sometimes it will shift. Not so bad today, except that the plastic on my 39 foot is, or my 34 foot is catching. There we go. And I'm going to sew all the way down to where it was before, cut my thread. Then I go over to my ironing board, and look at that, it's a perfect fit. I go over to my ironing board and I will press this out so that it rolls more easily to the back. Let me find a, here, let's do this corner. So you're going to, once you've pressed it away, you're going to fold over the right side. I do this on all 4 corners. I fold over the right side, and then I go back and I fold over the left side. And you can see it makes an absolutely perfect miter. So by setting those up before I start sewing by hand, I have them all ready to go, and doesn't take me any time at all to finish it up. So that's a few helpful hints and tips and tricks on traditional quilt binding. I hope that this has been helpful and that you'll watch our other videos. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell at youtube.com/Quilting Delights. Thanks a lot, and we'll be back with you soon with more tips and tricks.